Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Welcome everyone, Alexandria Miller here, and welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. One of the highlights for many this year has been the return of Carnival. After a few years of official hiatus due to the pandemic, of course, it has been great to revel in our celebrations of resistance and endurance, and of course, in tribute to the resistance and rebellions of those who came before us, as we even alluded to in an earlier episode I've had on Carnival for Strictly Facts. So while every Caribbean body deserves its own episode on its Carnival history, which I'm sure we will get to over time, in this episode, we're chronicling the unique aspects of Carnival in the Isle of Spice, Grenada. So joining the show is Caribbean history educator and owner of Spice Island Digi-Content, Christell Simeon. So thank you so much, Christell, for being here. Please tell everyone a bit about yourself, where I'm sure they can guess by now, but where you're from, and what inspired your work on Grenada's history.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for having me on the podcast. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first podcast, and I'm super excited. So my name is Christell Simeon. I'm from the beautiful island of Grenada. We are a tri-island state of Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. Grew up in Grenada and lived there until I was about age 26, and then I migrated to Canada. So I'm currently based out of Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada, to be exact. And I still carry and wear my Grenadian pride, my history, my culture, my heritage with me, even though I'm in a foreign country. A lot of my identity is rooted in my culture, heritage, and history. A bit about me and what drew me to this area. I always loved history. History was my favorite subject in secondary school. I had awesome teachers. In college, I had a teacher by the name of Dr. Nicole Philip Dow. She had a doctorate in history, and I was so amazed that someone could study history. I was like, oh my God, like that is just was so fascinating. I really just drew my passion into it. And then I taught Caribbean history for 8 years in Grenada. I taught at an all boys high school there before migrating to Canada. And it was really in 2020 during the pandemic and couldn't travel back to Grenada because flights were locked down, quarantine, that I thought, um, if this was going to be long term, how would Grenadians continue to maintain their rich culture, heritage, and history, right? So I said, digitalizing our history and culture, bringing it online would be a good way for Grenadians if this pandemic was to last forever, could still remain connected to their history and culture, as well as we have over 100,000 Grenadians living in the diaspora. It's said that we have more in the diaspora than on island. So also for them to feel connected to their culture, history, and heritage. So a Spice Island Digi content was started, and we have our brand, Island Learning Grenada, which focuses on educating on Grenada's history, heritage, and culture. We offer virtual classes, we have online self-paced courses, and of course, we have our blog.
Well, just like your business, we'll be tapping into Grenada's history a bit today. One place I really want us to foreground our conversation is that while a lot of us celebrate Carnival, Carnival across the Caribbean is not a homogenous festival. We all have our own intricacies, our own, histories and things, and, even down to when it takes place, right? So in Grenada's case, Spicemas, as it's known, used to follow the Lenten season, but until the 1970s, the date changed. So for the first time in its history, it was actually canceled in 1974 due to independence and then
Mhm.
changed to May,
Mhm.
and which also I then believe carried on for the next 4 years or so. And that change from having it, in our that kind of February
Mhm.
period to May it really was described by UE librarian Nell Payne in her article Grenada Mass 1928 to 1988 as, and I quote, traumatic, and that Carnival was a faint shadow of itself for having moved to May. The date, was later changed to August, which is continued since 1984 to allow for greater tourist attraction during the summer and also travel for locals to, even possibly travel to like Trinidad Carnival, for example. And so, given all of these differences, what do you think are the major functions or purposes of Carnival in the Caribbean, especially for small islands like Grenada?
So for small islands like Grenada, Carnival is a main source of economic activity for the cultural practitioners, the creatives who are involved in Carnival. They look forward to Carnival each year because that's how they earn their revenue. So the wire benders, the mass band leaders, those in steel band, and the soca artists. Mostly the Carnival period is where really drives their income. So it's a main economic driver for a small island like Grenada. Another function of Carnival, it's really a showcase of a diverse, unique, and rich culture to people. We have many unique aspects of our culture that are uniquely Grenadian, and that time of year allows us to showcase it to visitors. Thousands of visitors come to the shows each year to participate in Carnival. And then since the pandemic, we've also been um, broadcasting it virtually so that we can reach our broader audience with the carnival so they can really see that the diversity of what carnival is like in Grenada. And rightly said, in August now, Spicemas is unique because we are one of the last carnivals for the entire carnival season. So we're uniquely positioned like that, and it allows people to experience Trinidad Carnival, and they do several other islands, and then they kind of end in Grenada, and then the next carnival would be like in New York or Miami in October. So it really closes off the carnival season in the Caribbean. Another major function of carnival, and this is relation to some of the traditional mass aspects of carnival, it is really a form of intergenerational transfer of culture. And this happens in that in some aspects of traditional mass, we have both young and senior players playing together. For example, in Shotney Mass, in Vekomas, while Indians, we have children as young as 3 years old, and then we have seniors who are in their 60s. So it allows that natural passing down of culture from one generation to the next. And it allows Grenada to maintain its rich and diverse aspects of its culture and heritage. And that's very important. We have a small population, only 100,000 people, and we haven't grown over the last 20 years. We're stuck in that 100,000 to 110,000. So for us to really maintain our identity, we have to pass our culture down naturally as much as possible. And Carnival allows us to do that. And then most importantly, building on that point, Carnival really consists of a plethora of traditional aspects that began on the days of the plantation and has since transcended into what is modern carnival. So many aspects were starting as part of plantation life. For example, calypso is one. Calypso was started as a way for the slaves on the plantation to express themselves in the form of a satire, express their lives and what was taking place with them. And then once slavery ended and we started into the post-emancipation period, Calypso carried on and it moved into village tents. And there was the start of Calypso tents around the island, the first being in 1958 A small tent was started, and from since then we have continued with the tent tradition of calypso, and calypso is now on its own night and called the match gras, which is Sunday night in French, because of the European influence there, and it remains a core part of carnival. So it helps to maintain our culture and preserve aspects of it for over 400 years. Given that the first set of slaves would have landed in Grenada in the 1600s, and now in 2022, we're talking over 400 years, Carnival really helps us to maintain, practice, and transfer our culture and our identity. And the last point I want to say, for Grenada especially, aspects of our carnival like the jab jab makes us unique. We use it as our brand, and maintaining carnival is equal to keeping us alive. It's the air we breathe, the water we drink, because we associate it to our identity. And from my research, Grenada is one of the, if not the only island where the culture is so tied to our identity as our people.
Owning to some of the last points you made, you talked about Veko, you talked about Jab Jab. Just give us a little bit more context about some of those really unique aspects of Spicemas that are, very integral to Grenada that you may not find in other islands.
Yes, so I'll start off with, of course, the most unique aspect, which is jab jab. So on Carnival Monday morning, it's Juve morning, and that is where you can see jab jab. So jab jab, it comes from the French word. It's called diable, meaning devil, and it's really the painting of the body in old oil, which is black. So persons grease down themselves in that old oil, and then they take to the streets, men, women, children. They carry props such as bullhorns, they carry snakes, frogs, manicure, they beat drums, and then they chant. And this whole street in St. George's is lit with people playing jab jab. Grenada started jab jab. It's endemic to us. Other islands in the Caribbean have some aspect of what is called a Juve like. But the real core jab jab was started in a parish in Grenada called St. Andrews, in the community of La Digue, and it has over the years progressed into the big celebration that it is on Carnival Monday, and to which other islands emulate, whether it's blue jab jab, red, Trinidad have their own kind of jab jab, but the core of it is Grenadian, and that's black. We also have traditional mass, and traditional mass comes in several different forms. So we have shortney, veko, wild Indian, moko jumbi, sailor mass, and the juju warriors. These are some that you can see every year. There are others that have now extinct. They're no longer there, but these remain. Well, shortney's a colorful masquerade. Players adorn themselves from head to toe in colorful wear, and they carry white powder and they dirty the streets with white powder as they parade the streets on, mostly on Carnival Monday, Carnival Tuesday. Then we have Veko. Veko has French influence. The island of Grenada was colonized by the French in the 1700s, and there are many aspects of French influence, but Veco is only one. It's very rural based, started in the parish of St. Max and continues to the masqueraders adorn themselves in long clothing, often black, with a red or green or yellow. They wear wooden clogs on their feet, and that makes the sound as they parade the streets. So you often hear the vehicle before you see them, and that's unique about them. The wild Indians, that is based upon the Amerindians. So there was a period of Amerindian inhabitation of Grenada, mostly the Kalinagos are the Caribs. So the wild Indian masquerade is a representation of the Indian. So their appearance is that they paint their bodies in red and white paint and they wear colorful clothing, similar to how the Indians would have worn their appearance. And also there's some influence from the American Indians too as well. Again, a rural based, what it is practiced. Moko Jumbi, so Moko Jumbi is stilt walking. So people get up on those stilts that could go as much as 6 feet in height. And it's based off a West African tradition because the Jumbi is a spirit in the West African folklore stories. And the whole thought behind of the Moko Jumbi is that it's protection over people. That's why it's so tall and it towers over the rest of the mass on the street on Monday and Tuesday. So it's really a form of protection. Then we have the sailor mask. So the sailor mask is uniquely infused with American and European. The idea came from naval ships that would have came to the Caribbean, came to Grenada, and with Navy sailors. So today we portray masqueraders wear sailor mask clothing and they parade the streets. So that is the sailor mask. And then the Juju warriors, it's one of the aspects that is close to dying out. There's only one very small band that remains in Grenada today. And the Juju warrior again comes from the West African tradition. It's the whole protection or warrior, very colorful masquerade from head to toe adorned in colorful pieces of cloth and with a face mask, and it's mostly played by men and women and some small children, but it's very small. So those are the unique aspects of Grenada's carnival, mostly the traditional mask, because we got the traditional mask, and then we also, of course, we have the pretty mask, fancy mask.
One thing that I find very just, telling about how our culture resonates is that even some of the characters that you've mentioned that are so integral to Carnival or Spicemas are representative of different parishes, right? And so I think, especially in like Veku's case, it's native to St. John and St.
Yes,
Mark, right?
yes.
I think similarly to the point that you referenced earlier, Grenada is a tri-island state. And so there are a lot of other parts about Carnival that I think are very reflective of that wider definition of what is the Grenadian state, especially in terms of, what are the folk traditions and importances that derive from, previous times. So in sharing some of these with us, could you talk about Carriacou and how Carriacou has definitely influenced Grenadian carnival culture. I'm even thinking of, the string band particularly.
So Carriacou has its own carnival. It's usually in February of each year, so it lines up with the same time that Trinidad has its carnival. And originally, Grenada Carnival was that same period as you mentioned, and then it moved to May and then to August. But Carriacou has kept it in February. So Carriacou really is the mecca of culture. We talk about Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. Culture is Carriacou is I call the Mecca, the cultural capital of the Tri-Island state. And Carriacou, they have done a lot to maintain their culture and their heritage. And their culture is both an infusion of African as well as European influence. They have folk traditions such as the big drum, quadrille music. So the quadrille in itself is mostly European in its root, right? But then, of course, you have the string band music that accompanies it, and also the drums, which is the West African. So it's really that mixture of both West African and European influence. And then we have the Shakespeare Mass. So the Shakespeare Mass is only practiced mostly during that Carnival Tuesday in Carriacou. So Shakespeare Mass, Well, the root is European, so the recital of plays from Shakespeare, such as Julius Caesar, that's what the masqueraders do on Carnival Tuesday. They recite words and lines and quotes from Shakespeare on the street in front of many thousands of spectators watching them as they do that. They also do like stick fighting. So stick fighting has really died out mostly in Grenada on the mainland, but Carriacou still maintains it as part of its Shakespeare mass. And stick fighting dates back to the days of the sugar plantation. Basically, this whole idea of men competing for power, which two men will fight each other using sticks. Well, in today's societies, basically men from competing villages come together and they use the sticks and play fight each other in the street while spectators watch. So that's a key aspect of Carriacou mass and folk traditions. In terms of Grenada and Carriacou, they have maintained their own aspects with some infusion into Grenada. So in the last maybe I would say 5 years, string band music now comes over to Grenada. So there's a string band, the Carriacou string band, and they come over to Grenada throughout the year, and they also and that brings that kind of percussion music to Grenada. And we're just getting into a Shakespeare mass being on the mainland too as well. Given that Carriacou last year applied for the Shakespeare mass to be listed by UNESCO as one of the intangible heritage, right? Which is huge, right? So to really say that's unique to a place, right? So that has elevated its presence and its popularity. But Carriacou, it's the cultural capital. It's rich, it's diverse, it's well maintained and preserved. It's practiced throughout the year. So we have Carnival mostly, but then they also do Maroon Festival. They have their own Parang Festival in December. So it's unique like that. So I would say we have Grenada, Carriacou, and Pittimatic, and Carriacou is really important to maintaining, of course, and preserving the culture that is totally Grenadian.
And I think to that point, right, there are so many ways, and even to your earlier point about how we preserve history and culture, there are so many actors, I think, and agents on the ground in Carriacou that have been training students in this history, right? So thinking of people like Jenny Duncan or Mary Noel, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who at the Mount Pleasant Government School have been maintaining this heritage. And the list goes on. I'm not exhausting the list by any means, but in true fashion, Carnival is a place where you can hold so much of where we come from. It's a different way of learning and a different way of memorializing our histories, right? It's not only passed down through performance, but it lives in us, I guess, in a way, through
Yes.
performance, in a way that, books and things don't always get to do as well.
Mm-hmm.
We did talk about a point that I definitely wanted to mention, or we kind of glossed through it through our conversation, the distinction between traditional mass and pretty mass or fancy mass, right? It's come up, but I think oftentimes, especially due to social media, pretty mass or fancy mass is what is oftentimes the most popular thing that trends, on Instagram or whatever. And so
Yes.
a lot of the characters and performers you've mentioned are really truly a part of traditional mass. So could you make that distinction between what traditional mass is like in Grenada and how it's different from fancy mass, and maybe what you think it functions and how it functions differently than the other?
So yeah, so the difference between traditional mass and pretty mass or fancy mass really stems from the origin of both masses. So the traditional mass is grounded in the rural parishes and the rural economy. So traditional mass such as Shotney, Veko, Wild Indian, these are based in the rural parishes of Grenada. For example, St. John, St. Mark, St. Patrick's, St. Andrews, and then the Wild Indian has its core based in St. David currently. Right, so it's really part of the rural, and the idea of it stemmed from the fact that traditional mass was practiced by peasants. So in the post-emancipation period after slavery was ended, many of the freed slaves, they found their economic independence by becoming small-time farmers or what is called peasants. So traditional mass was a low cost, simple way for them to participate in carnival. That's why the clothing used by the masqueraders is mostly cloth based and they use simple aspects to make their costumes, whether it's bells on their feet, powder, natural materials to make their face mask, etc. And that is because of the origin of it and who really started that kind of mask in Grenada. The fancy mask or the pretty mask has always traditionally been a mask of the elite. So fancy mask was started on the plantation. It was the plantation owners. They brought that from England, from France, etc. It was at the time it was mostly European-based clothing that was used. So during the period of Carnival, the plantation owners, the whites, they would dress in the European clothing and parade the streets. Many years now that has stripped down into the pretty costumes and so forth that you see on the streets on Carnival Monday and Tuesday. And pretty much is basically played by everybody today, but it's found in the city center. So St. George's, that's where Carnival Tuesday is based, and many of the bands that participate in Fancy Mass are from the capital. And then in the outer parishes, the capital is where the pretty mass is played. So that is the main distinction from the origin of the difference between two. On the streets, though, the traditional mass is more mundane. So basically, you could observe it. As I said, you could most times hear the mass before you see it because you could hear the shotney coming down. You could see the white powder all over the place. You could hear the vehicle as they make their way down the street, right? The moko jumbi like to go in and between the mass, right? So you can see it and it's nice to observe. Just stand on the street and watch it. If you're participating in it, that's its own immersive experience. The pretty masses is where all the hype, it has become very socialized today because of social media and the influence of the neighboring Trinidad and Tobago that has really this eloquent pretty mass that Grenada now has more or less is copying in many aspects. And it's a hype mass, pretty costumes, loud music, the infusion of soca on the street, and people enjoying themselves. So I would say pretty mass is to be played. If you want to play a mass, a pretty mass, the traditional mass, if it's not for you, it's nice to observe, right? So that would be the difference there. But both are its own kind of cultural expressions.
And in a very just kind of stark way, I think traditional mass so beautifully, as you mentioned, captures our ancestry in a way that, well, I mean, I guess to an extent, Pretty Mass does as well because we are
Yes.
we're blends of wherever we've come from. But I think that rural element and understanding how those who were either enslaved or newly emancipated then turned into and created traditional mass for themselves and their own emancipation is also another reason why traditional mass definitely deserves to be highlighted. I think in a way that Pretty Mass sometimes overshadows.
Yes, there's definitely an overshadow for sure on the traditional mass because really the traditional mass really is what really it makes the carnival unique in itself because those elements cannot be found in many of the other islands. So whereas the pretty mass is found across the region in the diaspora, worldwide carnival has gone, the pretty mass portion of it has gone worldwide and not so much for the traditional mass that has remained mostly endemic.
Well, of course, my last question, as you know, we've definitely been highlighting traditional mass, particularly and thinking about Grenada's uniqueness and the just amazing, I think, history behind what Grenada's carnival looks like. What are some of your favorite examples of how Spice Mass shows up in contemporary popular culture?
So one of the ways that Spicemas is showing up now is the jab jab. So jab jab has moved from just the playing of jab jab. There is a whole jab jab music genre that is being created, right? So for the last 10 years, work has been done to bring the jab jab elements into the music, so that too is making it part of our broader audience, right? So the jab jab music. So that work is mostly being led by a gentleman. His name is Ian Charles. He has the brand Jambalasi Grenada. It's you could find them on Google. They have a website. They have a YouTube channel. So they're really carrying on the jab jab music and infusing that music into soca and getting it on our world stage so that people can also get to know jab jab in a different way. We also have our own soca icon. So definitely Mr. Killer. He's a pioneer in terms of Caribbean entertainment. He's Grenadian, originally from the parish of St. John's, and he has been making his way on the regional and international stage to carry our music out of Grenada. I mean, they used one of his songs in one of the shows Real Housewives of Atlanta, right? The opening song for that one of the seasons was done by Mr. Killer, right? So he's pioneering the music. And then most recently last year, the Shakespeare Mass got a stage in Dubai and Venice. So one artist there, her name is Susan Mains. She's not Grenadian, although if you meet her, most people think she's Grenadian. She's actually, I think, Canadian, who has been living in Grenada for many years, and her art was in display in Dubai and also in Venice. And you can check out her website, susanmeansgallery.com, and you can see the Shakespeare Mass in art form. So that's another way in which our culture is going out of just Carnival Monday and Tuesday in August or in Carriacou and into more contemporary aspects of life itself.
Definitely. And I mean, I think even just the mere fact of pushing towards UNESCO, highlighting Shakespeare Mass as hopefully one day an intangible heritage site, or what is it, intangible heritage?
Um, I think it's listed as just a practice. I want to believe the
Okay.
intangible cultural heritage of humanity. They have a list, right? So
Yeah.
that's what it's gonna be on. Yes.
Yes. So I think, that in itself, I think really sets
Oh yeah.
Grenada apart, and hoping that that will come through and further bring together just the notoriety that is Spice Mass.
Oh yes.
So for all who have not been to Grenada, who have not traveled to and been a part of Spice Mass, I hope this episode definitely helped motivate you to check out some of the parts that you may not always readily see on social media. Christell, I thank you so much for sharing a bit about your culture and history with us. And for those who want to learn more, can also check out Spice Island Digi content to learn a little bit more about Grenadian history. For all of our listeners, as always, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was such an honor to have Christell on with us and talk a little bit more about Grenada. We will have, I'm sure, several more episodes in the works together, but we hope you all enjoyed. And till next time, little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.